Hello everyone, we have a very special guest again, Dr. Töppel.
Hello.
And today we will talk about the T-34 and namely what the different opinions were, because the channels after the war and during the war sometimes wrote very interesting aspects about it, but what was the soldiers' view as well. So for instance, when some authors brought this up, like the T-34 was sometimes quite overhyped by various German generals, and for me it has a bit both sides. So for instance, to a certain degree I think it's an excuse, and the other aspect is of course the grass is always greener on the other side. So what is your view on this?
Okay, yeah, that's a good point with the generals, because one of the most famous or infamous, for me infamous memoirs is Friedrich Wilhelm Mellentin's what is it? I know the German title, Panzerschlachten, and in English it's has several editions in English.
Probably
Panzer Battles. Sorry,
Panzer Battles.
Battles. So we did just this ad hoc interview. I didn't know the questions before, so sorry when I mixed something up. And he writes something like, T-34 was the best tank in World War II. And of course, all the Soviet and Russian historians, they loved that quote, and they quoted and said, Mellentin, famous German general, he writes that T-34 was the best German tank. Okay, in 1941, the T-34 came as a shock to the German generals, to the whole Wehrmacht. Yeah, for the Panzer soldiers, infantry, of course, and for the generals. And there was this, we have to rebuild it, we have to copy it, we have to, as fast as we can get it, a copy, or we have to you know all about this, we could do a separate video about how to counter a T-34. And of course the infantry was always frightened when they saw a T-34, when no heavy weapons were around, so you couldn't say the infantry laughed at some point. That was never the case. But for the tank command, it's a different story. When you were a Tiger commander in late 1942 or 1943, the terror was totally obsolete. Yeah, it was, for most of the time, a T-34 with a 76mm gun was an easy kill for a Tiger commander. Not so much for a Panzer IV. It's a bit different story. They're quite equal, but the Panzer IV had a better cannon, and for a Panzer III, it's a different story. The Panzer III is inferior to a T-34. So you have to ask, so which perspective are we talking about? But the generals, in the memoirs, we already did a video about memoirs and stuff. Like my best example is Mellentin. He never came back to another conclusion, and historically correct, he could have written, okay, 1942 with a long-barreled Panzer IV and with a Tiger tank, okay, we outmatched the T-34. No, he writes the T-34 was the best tank in World War II, and this is a quote that lives on.
I mean, I also think I read they noted at some point that the T-34 was better in every aspect in 1941, and I made a video because I was quite confused when I read the book from Kavallerchik, which you recommended in one of your talks about tanks in Barbarossa, and then I read what all the problems were with the T-34, which I put out in my video about the T-34 against the Panzer III, and they clearly pointed out aspects that were not better, and I clearly looked at this and I think, the grass is always greener on the other side, because when you're shot at by a T-34, you see he has a better gun, he has better armor, but you don't see that he has quite some problems, for instance, with optics, or he doesn't know visibility issues, and many other points that usually don't come up, because there are also some, I think, who was it? One author, I think Jens put all the information in what US tankers thought about German tanks.
Okay.
And they were also like these were some wonder weapons, but they also had some issues with the Panther and the Tiger were not some invulnerable tanks as well.
We have these accounts from the Battle of Kursk. You know, I did a lot of research for 20 years, more than 20 years now, on the Battle of Kursk, and we have accounts from German tank commanders that took part in the Battle of Kursk, and they say that the T-34's main disadvantage was his four-man crew, because the commander was it was in total stress, and he had to observe the battlefield, he had to act as a gunner, and he was incomplete. It was too much for him in battle, and so many T-34s couldn't react tactically, so they could just fire 3 shots a minute and so on, couldn't really see, and they acted very
overtaxed, but that's all not the perfect word. Overtaxed. Too much to do.
Too much to do in this tank, so he couldn't really react on things that were going on. And when another tank showed up, and he was just acting as a gunner, and he couldn't observe the battlefield, he did miss the other tank, and so that's what many German tank commanders noted.
I mean, that was the same in the Battle of France. I think Frieser wrote about this. Is basically that to a certain degree the French tanks turned into pillboxes at one point, because the commander usually also had to be the gunner as well, and so he couldn't command or something, and everything. The whole efficiency goes down of the whole. And it's also what Chifton pointed out. Yeah. Because if you have a 2-man turret, you need a 3-man turret basically in a modern tank on a fast battlefield environment with radio communication and everything going on.
Yeah, and good. You have to have a good view with the optics, and that was very bad in T-34 too.
And if you're on the other side if you're the other end of the T-34 barrel, you don't see that there are only 2 guys in the turret, and the guy can't come up. That the commander is already completely überfordert.
So and we make a little thing.
Yeah, we had something in there, and so this is the perspective what I wanted to say. With the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah. I mean. I want to have a little excursus. I know we're talking about T-34, but even from the Soviet perspective, but also from the German the perspective, I've always wondered why they say the T-34 was the most dangerous Soviet tank. I always thought, oh my goodness, when it came to KV-1 with the additional armor, and that must have been quite more horrible than a T-34. But only one German assault gun commander told me, this was. For me, not the T-34 was the big shock. It was the KV-1. But I met only one who said that to me.
And Ralf Raths made a great point about this when I talked to him, and he said a lot of soldiers confused the two.
All right.
And back then, I remember I had 2 or 3 official or semi-official histories of Panzer divisions lying at my home, and I looked through them. And actually, after the war, there was like a T-34, there was a KV-1, and the caption for the picture was T-34. So even after the war, sometimes they got it wrong. It was without doubt. It was not like a bad picture. It was like, wait, what? I read this and I kept it in mind. And then Ralf Raths, in one of the talks we recorded, and he made this up, and I was I think this and this is quite interesting. So similar like. I mean, this is actually really interesting, because you have this on the Western Front. Yeah. With every tank is a Tiger.
And for the Germans, every tank is a T-34. There's a battle at Prokhorovka, and I will write an article about this soon, because at the moment there is a big discussion about the German tank loss at Prokhorovka, and I did a lot of research, so I have to have the last word on this. So. In every report they say there were 152 T-34s, but 2 or 1, maybe half of the tanks, or 1/3 of the tanks were T-70s, light tanks. But you couldn't really make the difference. And there's one quite not really funny story, but when you tell it now, it's funny. But for them at the time, it's not really funny. I talked to Horst Naumann. He was a Sturmgeschütz commander and a recipient of the Knight's Cross, and he said he was in 1944. In his assault gun, and his loader or his gunner said, hey, Lieutenant, the Russians come again with the small tanks. Die kommen wieder mit den kleinen. And he looked, because there's a difference. He saw normally in 1941 you had the bigger tanks, the T-34 and the KV-1, and there was this BT, and and T-26, and you saw the difference, at long range. And he said, hey, jetzt kommen die wieder mit den kleinen. They come again with the little tanks, like maybe they don't have enough tanks anymore. And Naumann looked, but no, the bigger tanks were the IS-2, IS-2 tanks, and the smaller tanks were T-34s, so they were really in trouble. But they managed to knock out some, because they managed to get in the side of the flanking them, and they knocked out a IS-2 IS-2 tank. But it was like, oh no, they're not coming in the little tanks. So they have a new one there. So
I mean, this is the thing generally when I think that the human memory or everything tends to reduce everything to one or two elements. This is also something I read recently about marketing. And if you look at the Second World War nowadays, and you ask people about tanks, they know the T-34, they know the Tiger, and they know the Sherman, and likely the Churchill. So basically everyone, except for the experts or more interested people, they reduce everything usually to one tank or something. And so it also makes sense which tank comes up mostly. And I mean, this is quite interesting because for 1941, the T-34 was clearly not the most common tank, but it was the tank that probably produced the most trouble. Exactly. But they mixed them also on with the KV-1. So so basically, you have this big thing, and the T-26 and the BTs, nobody wrote about them because they had no issues, or rare, I guess, a few issues dealing with them.
And they were easy kills, even for the older German models. We talked about Otto Carius, and he told me I asked him about his tank kills, and he said, to be precise, I knocked out 2 or 3, he told me a number, I've forgotten it now, but I knocked out, let's say, 5 tanks as a gunner, because as a commander I didn't knock out tanks, my gunner knocked out tanks, so it was like his modesty was really great. And he said, this was very easy, he said, these were these old Blechbüchsen.
These old
tin cans. He referred to the T-26 and the BT model, and I think he was a commander of a 38T. And he said they were tin cans. So most of the tanks of 1941, from the German perspective, were tin cans, but when the T-34 and the KV-1 appeared, that made quite a whole myth. They had a myth, and we now think, when we think of 1941 and the tank shock, we always think about this not very few numbers. There were already quite a lot of numbers,
around 800 to 1,000 or was.
I think even more.
I mean, at the beginning, I think.
At the KV, you might be right.
And, I mean, just for the T-34, I think.
And T-34 was, and of course it was a big number, but most of the tanks that the Germans encountered in 1941 were
T-26,
what they call
BT-5,
the tin cans. Okay.
And also a lot of issues, I think, were with lack of lubricants and ammunition and a lot of stuff. Why was many of the T-34 and KV-1 were not that effective in the end, because they were more overrun or abandoned. I mean, there are also these pictures, like I'm not sure, I think there are at least one picture of T-34s that are stuck in a swamp, and also with KV-1s or KV-2s and something like that.
So last year I gave a talk on the battle at Dubno. You find it on the internet, but it's in German. Sorry.
So
and I talked about that, and I think only half of the tanks that the Soviets had for the battle just made it on the battlefield, because the other half broke down, and even the new T-34s and KV, they broke down because the Panzer drivers were not used to these tanks, and so they damaged it, and so many of the tanks made it on the pictures of German soldiers who took shots. I saw a big tank, but they didn't make it on the battlefield.
I think there's this famous picture of a T-34 which has another engine or transmission on the back behind the turret strapped to it, just in case the other breaks down, or I don't know, maybe salvaged it or something.
So this was maybe the main problem for the Soviets in 1941. That they had a lot of tanks, but many of them didn't even make it to the battlefield. And even when they made it to the battlefield, some of them hadn't even the right ammunition.
Or the gun was not sighted in,
a lot of
lance points.
A lot of problems in 1941.
So this is always the issue. Numbers. Be always careful. There's quite the difference between numbers, operational numbers, between losses, total losses, all the stuff. But that's something I think for another video.
Yeah.
So thank you for watching.
Thank you.
And see you next time. Bye.